And I wrote down that the point of the embodied mind is to be relational. So if I do all these neurogenic things, like eat my blueberries and chew my carrots, take my omega-3s and run, but then when I go out to be relational, I'm a complete jerk, then that's going to undo a lot of that neurogenic activity. What I'm trying to say is that if we're able to be our best self neurogenically and grow our best brain, we need to actually reinforce that with the equivalent gestures and actions with our body embodied as a relational and gesturetic apparatus instrument. And so when I was sharing about the woman coming to visit me, I think she almost sparked neurogenesis in me. Even if it wasn't actually new neurons, it was actually turning on some of the circuits and connections that in my fear and awful state were taking a back seat. She almost brought them back to the forefront. So there's this reactivation of the relational mind, which is more powerful than the drug. The care of a person is more powerful than a drug. So I feel like not only can we activate neurogenesis and facilitate it within ourselves by taking omega-3s and eating blueberries and things like that, we can be neurogenic activators for someone else by these epigesturetic and endogesturetic and endomimetic and epimimetic ways. If we do something, for example, that makes somebody fearful, we're turning off their neurogenesis. But if we do something to make somebody feel safe and like they're being received kindly, that's going to turn it back on. So it's not just about these individual factors, it's what we're doing, our actions and our thoughts. I would say that thoughts turn off neurogenesis because thoughts are old. So they're old brain cells happening over and over again, and those are old, so it's not anything new. So to make a new connection, we have to see the connection. So it's actually about seeing. And what I was saying with the whole thing about a person being in so-called psychosis and having hallucinations and saying things that don't seem like they have any relevance in reality, I was thinking it's sort of equivalent to how in a flock of birds, one bird will be the bird that calls out if they see danger. And by sitting there and calling out, they're actually making themselves a target. They're making it so that predator's going to come and get them first. They could just fly away and be the first to leave because they saw it first. But they call out. And I feel like with this whole hallucination, we're actually calling out about stuff that we see. It's a predator that we see, and it's actually thought itself. And we're calling out about it, but we don't know how to do that properly. And the trouble is that once we see it, it's kind of too late, and then we're saying stuff that doesn't make sense in order to point it out. Because once we've seen it, we're sort of beyond it. And when we're beyond it, we can't be used by it, but it uses us, and then we're not making sense, and then we're misperceived, and then we're captured. And I feel like I shouldn't talk about that too much because it seems kind of big, but... And I was thinking about insight and how insight comes from sight, when we see something, we can have an insight, and it's not the same as thought. Whereas thought is more like in sound. It's this sound that's just repeating inside. And when we have in sound, we can't have insight. When we see something, we understand something. The in sound, the thought, is quiet. And we have something new sneaking in. And it's kind of like sound, and it's kind of like sight. And we see it, and then we can give voice to it. Now, for most people, I think that doesn't happen that often, but when it does, it makes us really pause, and we're waiting, and then we see it. We see it, and then it comes to us what we just saw. Now, that can happen a lot. It can actually happen too much. And so insight is seeing the relatedness of things often. And the relatedness is the space in between those two things. And from that space, when we see that space, we can give voice to that space that we saw. Whereas if there's always this in sound happening, there's no space for that other sound of insight. When we see the space between two things. Normally we're seeing along the track of the in sound, and there's no space at all. It's like a line that we're seeing, and there's no space between one thought, one sound, and another. And it's just this line. There's no two things through which to see the space in between. Sometimes when I get to that place where I see too much, I see that I am that space. I feel like I am that space. And I feel like it's difficult, because if I'm sitting at a table with a couple of people, like 5 people, I feel like I'm all those people and me and all of this space. I don't feel like I'm me in this separate body, so it feels weird. I do prefer the perception of just feeling like me in a body. I guess the weird part of the weird part of it is that when I leave those people, those particular people, I wonder, they're still out there, right? Because if I felt like all of us when we were together, then who are we when we're apart? I don't get it. Sometimes I feel like I'm supposed to actually be getting used to some of these sensations. I want to eventually take a course with Patch Adams, or his education program, one of his courses. But I was on his website, and he has a quote, "Friendship is the best medicine." And I think that's true. I'm actually going to write to him, I think. He only reads handwritten letters, not emails. And I thought of a little phrase, listening over labels. And that goes with the friendship thing, right? I watched another TED Talk in my random TED Talk watching by Ricardo Semler. And his was one of the most impressive TED Talks I've ever listened to. He was talking about other ways that he has structured his business to be non-controlling, and people setting their own hours, and so many different things, and it was really amazing. And then he also talked about how he helped to start this school called Lumiere School, where the kids have a lot of freedom in what they learn, and the way he describes it in the TED Talk is really cool. And I'm kind of interested in the education of children, because I think the way we're educated now, our brains get so warped that a certain amount of us develop these so-called mental illnesses. It's like a scar in the brain, which is a scar created by our own voice constantly talking to us and saying things against ourselves and other people. That's not what the brain is designed for. It's designed for connection. It's designed to be social, and not just outwardly social while inwardly it's being very antisocial. We wouldn't want our thoughts texted to all our friends, to our whole contact list. So that's not really social, yet we're trying to be social outwardly. But the way we're educated actually creates that inside. So I thought what he talked about was really cool. And then I went to his website, and he has a document about leadership. I think it's called Leading Wise or something, because he's all about wisdom. I haven't read the whole document yet, but I skimmed through it, and there was a part about a Teal Organization, and it says it replaces lack of purpose with evolutionary purpose. It says a Teal Organization bases their strategies on what they sense the world is asking of them. And I think that's amazing. I feel like if I create some kind of peer-run organization, that's really the key, is what is the world asking of us? And I think one of the things, at least I feel, if I want to just say right now, I'm kind of a teal organization, or I'm a teal organism. I feel like the world is asking me to have this conversation with myself, because I am. I'm trying to talk about it differently and infinitely, and not in terms of right and wrong, but creatively, holistically, adaptively. So many different things. It's opening space, it's opening up more conversation, it's creating more memes, it's learning. And actually, learning was one of the things that other TED Talk said creates neurogenesis, creates new neurons. So this is just learning with myself, from myself, by talking to myself, and not having any kind of motive, but to just talk and give voice to something else that keeps changing, and sometimes folds back upon itself, and sometimes it goes beyond itself. So I'm definitely going to read more of this document. It also has videos in the document, because I am really interested in starting some kind of peer-run thing. And again, what do we sense the world is asking of us? Is it just asking us to share our story so that we reduce stigma of mental illness, or are we trying to become visionaries and share our gifts and be a neurotribe and take our unique place in society that is going to help? Gaia. I feel like a lot of times we give voice to Gaia. We're talking about random stuff which seems like delusions, but we're actually talking about what Gaia wants us to talk about, which is deforestation. Or when we're in such pain, sometimes something comes out of our mouth that's not very congruent, because we don't know the language of Gaia. We don't know what we're feeling. We don't know where these energies are coming from. But part of this conversation, in my view, of what the world is asking from us, is that we need to speak as the world. not as the ego self. And we're trying to speak as the world, and we're trying to learn to do that, but it's always misinterpreted as us being out there. I feel like the world is asking us to step into our gifts, or give voice to our gifts, or talk about things in a different way. Not just talk about ourselves and our symptoms, but seeing that our symptoms could be our strength. And they're not really symptoms of our own personal mental illness, but they're symptoms of the greater troubles, and that we're sensing them not just intellectually, but actually. We're highly sensitive people, and even if we weren't growing up, we've acquired that capability. So we need to design our lifestyle for that. We need to create safety for ourselves in the meantime, and also have strategies to prevent falling into the trajectory of needing so much medical attention. And Ricardo asked the question, which was one of his guiding questions: what am I doing this for? Why am I doing this? Why am I talking to myself like this? To learn about myself, to think about the brain, to ponder, to wonder, to be curious. All these dimensions that we innately had as children. To play with ideas, to realize I have no idea, to say I don't know, to say maybe. And maybe to invite other people to start doing the same. To write over that story that we've been told about ourselves, and start creating a new one by talking to each other differently. And I think part of it is there's a selective pressure for us to grow towards we. And when we get a label, a lot of times we're more connected with we, the space, what we're sensing in that space, instead of just in our own mind and body. And that language that we don't understand, as it's not verbal, but when we feel it and then we try to put words to it, doesn't sound like it makes any sense. We're sensing something other than ourselves. And that's maybe part of the point of being a human being, is to sense something other than ourselves, than just what the ego is telling us about ourselves. Because that's pretty boring. It gets pretty old pretty fast. We've probably been saying the same stuff to ourselves for years. Now we could speak as that ego self, or we could speak as perception, as Gaia, which we all are. So we all know that language. We're just disconnected from it. We forget. It's probably a language of celebration, of ecstasy, not just of solving these problems that we've created for ourselves. I'm part of suffering so much and feeling so much suffering, and we feel the suffering of the world, and then it's internalized as thoughts against ourselves, and we think it's our own suffering, or it's resonating with our own suffering and amplifying that. We don't understand we're feeling the world's suffering, and if we're feeling that, that is our impetus to act. To do something altruistic, because we're feeling the pain of the world, but it's amplifying our own personal pain, so we're thinking it's our own pain. So we try to solve our own pain with things like addictions and all these band-aids, when the resolution is to switch to that altruistic way and empathetic way that we already are anyway. It's just a matter of action. And I was on the Bay Area Mandala Project website again, and they have something really cool. They have a special messages support line and support email. And I'll pop it up on a picture here. But I was thinking of calling my group or something Special Messages Wellness. But then I thought, I don't know about that. But a lot of it is special messages, which is again just any message that isn't of the self. And they also talked about system diversion strategy, and they have this flow diagram about different respites and things they want to create. And it interests me because actually, since my recent experience of being able to divert myself from the system, I feel like I want to somehow facilitate others to divert themselves from the system, which avoids that extra layer of trauma, and it also avoids the possibility of having iatrogenic illness introduced. So say I went to the psych ward again and I was put on that medication that makes me worse, which would be seen as worsening my mental illness, when really it's iatrogenic, it's from the meds, and then the meds make me worse and worse and worse until I'm at such a terrible point that maybe I am discharged to some kind of tertiary care facility where I'm continued on that dose and I have no control over my own medication, so there's no way for me to actually get tapered off that med unless a doctor believes me that the med is making me worse, because the worsening often justifies the means. And I'm not saying that happens in all cases, but I know from my own experience that's what happened. So the next time around, I diverted myself from the psych ward. I had control over my own medication, for giving myself extra medication for a short period of time and then taking myself off of it. And now I'm seemingly back to my talkative self. Whereas if I was put on it longer by a doctor doing exactly what's part of the protocol, but not part of the protocol in my nervous system, then I'm kind of screwed. So I'm interested in sharing that, so then maybe people will work towards being able to avoid it too, because it can be helpful, but it can also cause more problems, because they don't really ask for one's history. At least in the psych wards here, it's just like, oh, let's just start you on this. They don't consult community doctors, they don't consult previous hospitalizations, they don't consult other doctors who have seen me in the psych ward. So it's just a crapshoot, and that's not cool. And what I'm saying is, it would take a lot of work if I wanted to work on helping the system see that that's what happened. It's not going to change, is what I'm saying. So the only way it might change is at the level of the person who feels they want to work towards diverting themselves from that. And I think a lot of people do divert themselves from that, and it's called suicide. And it's terrible because the help sucks so often. And so people might choose not to call for help. And for some of us, if we don't call for help in the nick of time, it's too late. I've had that experience where I don't want to harm myself, but I am on a beeline to harm myself. And there's this part of me trying so hard not to. It's like this trajectory towards the end, and I'm like trying to divert myself, and I finally divert myself enough to call for help in the nick of time. But I feel like some people don't have that opportunity because maybe they think, I'm too scared of the help. And we can't ask them to find out if that's true. I think, and I'm not saying that's what happens to everybody, I'm saying for people like me who dissociate, get confused, get terrified in something like psychosis or PTSD, some people plan it and do it, and that's what they want to do. But there's a certain percentage of people that don't want to. But they're in fear and they're in terror, and they haven't planned not to. They don't have a plan not to do it. I have many plans not to do it. And I've created that redundancy for myself. And I haven't really been in danger of that for 2 years. But I still have all the safeties. And because I have the safeties, I feel like I can get myself off that beeline path to one of my safety nets. And that used to be the psych ward, but since I had a bad experience, now I know when I'm in that state where I'm trying to get myself off the trajectory of harming myself. And that was diverting myself to the psych ward, calling for help so somebody would take me to the psych ward. But now I don't know if I'm going to divert myself onto that trajectory. And last time I didn't. And I got myself to safety with my family. And luckily they didn't take me to the psych ward. Because I took a Seroquel myself, so I was calm enough that they didn't get freaked out. And in that way I was able to divert myself from the psych ward and from doing something to myself, which I didn't actually feel like I would, but being in that fearful state long enough, one can only stand it for a certain period of time. So yeah, I think it's awesome to create a systems diversion strategy and have different respite centers and things like that. But in the meantime, some of us individuals could create a diversion strategy of our own as part of, say, a RAP plan, RAP crisis plan. There's a section in there, acceptable and unacceptable treatments. If you say unacceptable treatment is the psych ward or unacceptable facility, well then you have to put in something else. You have to put in this friend's house, and you have to maybe make sure you take a PRN so when you get to the friend's house you're calm enough that they're not going to take you to the psych ward. There's a lot of thinking in place to make that happen, because right now there aren't peer respite centers, there aren't medication-free facilities, there aren't facilities where you could rest and then take your own PRNs, or safety houses. It's just not out there. So I want to continue to be able to not have that extra trauma of going to the psych ward, as it creates another layer of trauma, especially if it doesn't go smoothly, which is often dependent on how the doctor practices. And that's a variable I don't like, because there are a lot of great doctors, but then there are some that are paternalistic, or maybe they just don't resonate. And a lot of times if you say, well, this doctor doesn't resonate with me, that's not a good enough reason to switch, which I think it should be, because relationship and connection are the most important factor in healing. But to avoid that in general, I have to avoid the psych ward. And I did it once, and I feel it's likely that I'll be able to do it again. And so it's possible that the psych ward has lost a lifelong customer. So we need to, if we want, divert our trajectory away from the system. So for people with trauma, dissociation, and psychosis, going to the hospital can make it worse, or can re-traumatize us, or add that extra layer of trauma. So we have to have safety, lots of redundancy in our safety, and prevention from getting caught in the system to avoid re-traumatization and iatrogenic illness.